Hello everyone and welcome to my Y&R Trends channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The air in the Newman Enterprises office was always cool, almost clinically so, a deliberate contrast to the fiery personalities and simmering tensions that define the company's legacy. For Nick Newman, it was a second skin, the familiar chill of power and control. But today, as he stood staring at a seemingly innocuous line item in a subsidiary's quarterly financial report, a different kind of heat began to prickle at the back of his neck. It started as a faint, distant warmth, a mere curiosity. The numbers for a recent minor acquisition, a small tech firm absorbed to bolster Newman's digital security arm, didn't quite align. The final purchase price was higher than the initial valuation, a common enough occurrence, but the justification, vague references to post-valuation assets and consultancy fees, was written in a language Nick knew all too well. It was the dialect of obfuscation, a dialect he'd unfortunately become fluent in after a lifetime in Genoa City's cutthroat business landscape. He dismissed it at first, a paperwork error, an overzealous junior accountant padding a report. He made a mental note to have his assistant, Christine, send a follow-up email, and moved on with his day, the warmth receding to a barely perceptible ember. Yet the ember refused to die. It glowed in the dark corners of his mind during a tedious budget meeting, flared slightly when he passed the office of the executive who had signed off on the deal, a man who reported directly to his brother, Victor, but whose loyalties had recently seemed to shift. Over the next 48 hours, that single anomalous report became an itch he couldn't scratch. It was out of place, a single thread dangling from the immaculately woven tapestry of Newman corporate integrity. He found himself pulling on it during a quiet moment, logging back into the secured server and pulling the entire digital file for the acquisition, a sprawling collection of contracts, emails, and transfer orders. The initial warmth returned, now a steady low-grade fever. He scrolled, his eyes scanning the legalese, his businessman's instinct humming. Everything was pristine, perfectly crafted, and that in itself was the problem. It was too clean, too seamless. It was in the early evening, with the office silent save for the low hum of the server tower in the corner, that he found it. Not in the main contract, but in an attached PDF of bank transfer confirmations. A routing number he didn't recognize, an account listed under the opaque name PL Holdings, which had received a 7-figure facilitation fee. The name meant nothing, but the timing, the amount, it was a perfect hidden cog in the machine. The heat in his neck spread down his spine. This was no accident. This was a ghost in the system, a deliberate siphon. His most primal instinct was to look toward his father. Victor Newman's shadow was long, and his methods were notoriously complex, often involving labyrinthine schemes where only he knew the final destination. Was this one of his tests? A trap set for Nick to see if he was paying attention? Or was it a move against Victoria? The family dynamics were a constant, low-grade war, and financial subterfuge was a preferred weapon. He spent the next morning digging deeper, his access codes granting him entry into deeper financial archives, his inquiries masked as a routine internal audit. He traced the routing number through a series of shell corporations, a classic Newman-esque strategy, layers of insulation designed to confuse and deter. Each layer he peeled back felt familiar, the scent of his father's machinations all over it. The heat within him was now a simmering anger, a familiar resentment toward the old man's endless games. He was preparing to confront Victor, to demand answers, to once again rail against the corrosive distrust that was his father's primary legacy. It was a chance conversation, a throwaway line, that changed the entire axis of his world. He was on the phone with a contact in the Cayman Islands, a discreet financial informant he used for particularly sensitive matters, verbally walking the man through the labyrinth of shell companies he'd mapped out. The final beneficiary is masked, but the origin point of the instruction, the authorization for the PL Holdings transfer, didn't come from the Newman executive suite, the informant said, his voice crackling slightly over the encrypted line. The digital signature on the initiating document has an administrative override code, one tied to a personal assistant's login with broad power of attorney privileges. Nick's blood ran cold, the heat in his body instantly replaced by an Arctic freeze. There were only a handful of people at Newman with that level of unauthorized yet fully empowered access. His mind raced, eliminating names. It wasn't Michael Baldwin, his legal counsel. It wasn't any of Victoria's people. His own assistant, Christine, was fiercely loyal but didn't have that specific clearance. The freeze then began to thaw into a terrifying specific burn as one name, one face, floated to the surface of his consciousness. A face he loved, a face he trusted implicitly. Phyllis Summers. His fiery, passionate, brilliant, and notoriously unpredictable wife. She had that level of access. He had given it to her himself, a symbol of his trust, a testament to their hard-won reunion. The world seemed to tilt on its edge. The hum of the office vanished, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in his ears. No, it was impossible. It couldn't be her. Not Phyllis. Not after everything. They had built something real, something solid out of the ashes of their past betrayals and chaos. She was his rock, his partner in the truest sense of the word. She understood his struggles with his family, his desire to be his own man, separate from the Newman empire. She was the one person he believed was unequivocally on his side. To suspect her felt like a betrayal in itself. But the evidence was a cold, hard stone in his gut. The login, the timing, her known history of creative problem-solving. The heat returned, now a conflagration of denial, confusion, and a dawning gut-wrenching horror. He ended the call abruptly, mumbling an excuse to the informant. He sat in his leather chair, the same chair where they had sometimes met for a stolen lunch, where she'd rubbed his shoulders after a tough day, and felt the foundations of his reality crack and splinter. He dove back into the data, but now his search had a new, agonizing focus. He wasn't looking for a corporate thief. He was hunting his wife. Every email, every log entry, every financial trail was now examined through this new devastating lens. He found the ghost in the machine, and it was Phyllis. A login from her home computer at 1:17 a.m., the night the transfer was initiated. An email from an encrypted, non-work account she used for personal matters, sent to the head of the acquired tech firm, suggesting a mutually beneficial understanding that existed outside the formal paperwork. The language was careful, but it was hers. The fiery, persuasive, slightly manipulative tone was uniquely Phyllis. He pieced it together slowly, the full, ugly picture coming into focus. She hadn't acted alone. The executive who signed off was in on it, likely receiving a smaller cut for his compliance. The acquired company's CEO had inflated the sale price, and the excess millions were funneled into the PL Holdings account. An account he could now prove, with a few more hours of digging, was controlled by a shell corporation that ultimately traced back to a trust fund for her son Daniel. It was a brilliant, audacious, and deeply cynical scheme. She had used her position, the trust he had placed in her, to secretly enrich herself and her family at the direct expense of Newman Enterprises, at the direct expense of him. The heat that had been building in Nick for days finally erupted, but it was not the clean, righteous anger he had felt when suspecting his father. This was a different inferno altogether. This was a white-hot blaze of personal betrayal, a pain so acute it was almost physical. It felt as if someone had reached into his chest and torn out a vital organ. He thought of her smile, her laughter, the way she would look at him with such unwavering support. It was all a lie. A magnificent, elaborate, and cruel lie. Every tender moment from the last few months was now cast in the sinister shadow of her deception. Had she been thinking of this scheme when they made love? When they talked about their future over a bottle of wine? When she assured him that he was the best thing that had ever happened to her? The questions were like shards of glass in his mind. The office, once his sanctuary, now felt like a crime scene, and he was the primary victim, sitting in the center of it, the last to know. He didn't move for a long time. The sun set outside his panoramic window, painting the Genoa city skyline in hues of orange and purple, a dramatic backdrop to his internal devastation. He felt numb, then furious, then profoundly sad. This was more than just money. It was a fundamental violation. She had seen his vulnerability, his deep-seated need for a loyal partner after a lifetime of familial warfare, and she had weaponized it. She had become the very thing he sought refuge from. He thought about confronting the executive, about going to Victor or Victoria with the evidence, about unleashing the full legal and corporate wrath of the Newman family upon her. But a deeper, more protective instinct kicked in, one that sickened him even as he felt it. Exposing her would mean a public scandal, a media frenzy, a humiliation that would ripple through their children's lives, through their entire world. It would destroy her. And despite the searing pain, the desire for vengeance, a part of him still recoiled from the thought of orchestrating her utter ruin. Finally he moved. He meticulously downloaded every piece of evidence, every incriminating email and financial record, and saved it to a secure encrypted drive. He then carefully erased his digital tracks from the company servers, making it look as if he had never been looking. He had to be smart now. He had to be cold. The passionate, impulsive Nick wanted to storm into their home and scream his accusations, to break things, to demand answers. But the son of Victor Newman, the man who had learned brutal lessons his entire life, knew that raw emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford. This required a strategy. He needed to understand her endgame. Was this a one-time gamble? Or was it the tip of an iceberg? Was she planning to leave him? Was she in some kind of trouble she hadn't told him about? The questions were endless, tormenting him. He left the office long after dark, the weight of his discovery a leaden cloak on his shoulders. The city lights, usually a symbol of life and energy, now seemed like a million watching, accusing eyes. He drove home not to his and Phyllis's penthouse, but to the Genoa City Athletic Club, needing a neutral space, a place to think, to breathe, to plan his next move. The home they shared was no longer a sanctuary. It was the heart of the deception, and he couldn't face it, couldn't face her, not yet. The confrontation was inevitable, a storm gathering on the horizon, but for now, he was alone with the devastating knowledge that the woman he loved, the woman he had built a life with, was a stranger, and the future they had dreamed of was nothing more than an elaborate fiction, meticulously constructed behind his back. The trust was broken, the foundation was shattered, and the heat of his anger was now matched only by the cold, desolate chill of a love that had been proven to be a lie. Nick Newman had always believed that trust was the foundation of any relationship, but lately, something about Phyllis Summers had begun to unsettle him. Their connection had always been intense, passionate, volatile, and unpredictable, but Nick could usually sense when something was off. In recent weeks, Phyllis had been secretive, her phone constantly buzzing with messages she'd quickly hide, and her mood swinging between nervous excitement and quiet guilt. At first, Nick brushed it off, telling himself that Phyllis was just being Phyllis, independent, fiery, and sometimes mysterious. But when those small inconsistencies began to pile up, he couldn't ignore the feeling that she was hiding something big. The kind of secret that could destroy everything they'd rebuilt. It started with a business meeting that never seemed to happen. Phyllis claimed she had an investor dinner for her latest tech venture, but Nick later found out the investor was out of town that night. When he casually mentioned it the next morning, she brushed him off with a half-laugh and a hasty explanation about scheduling mix-ups. Nick didn't push her, not then, but the seed of doubt was planted. Over the following days, she became even more evasive. She'd come home late, smell faintly of expensive cologne that wasn't his, and quickly change the subject whenever he asked about her evening. Nick wasn't the jealous type. Not anymore. But he couldn't shake the growing suspicion that Phyllis was entangled in something dark, maybe even dangerous. The turning point came one night when Nick stopped by the Grand Phoenix unexpectedly. He knew Phyllis was supposed to be there managing some new event, but when he walked into her office, the lights were dim and she wasn't alone. Through the glass wall, he saw her speaking in hushed tones to someone who shouldn't have been there. Tucker McCall. The man had been stirring up trouble all over Genoa City, and the last thing Nick expected was to find Phyllis in cahoots with him. Tucker's smirk said it all. This wasn't a casual meeting. There was tension in the air, a sense of conspiracy. Nick stayed hidden, watching just long enough to hear fragments of their conversation, phrases like, "cover it up," "he can't find out," and "the deal's already done." His stomach dropped. When Tucker finally left, Nick stepped into the room. Phyllis jumped like she'd seen a ghost, her confident mask slipping for a split second before she forced a smile. "Nick," she said too brightly, "you scared me. What are you doing here?" But Nick wasn't fooled. He wanted to believe her, to give her the benefit of the doubt, but her eyes darted away when he asked about Tucker. She spun a story about a harmless business collaboration, insisting it had nothing to do with him or Newman Enterprises. Yet Nick could tell she was lying. Her voice trembled slightly, her hands fidgeted, and she was avoiding eye contact. That night after she went to bed, Nick stayed awake for hours, thinking about how many times Phyllis had promised him honesty and how many times she'd broken that promise. The next few days, Nick quietly began to investigate. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but something inside him demanded the truth. He called in a few discreet favors, pulling some strings at Newman Media to dig into Phyllis's recent financial dealings. What he found made his blood run cold. Large unaccounted-for transfers had been made from one of her shell companies to an offshore account linked to Tucker's associates. Nick stared at the documents in disbelief. Was Phyllis helping Tucker with some sort of corporate espionage? Was she selling confidential information? Or worse, was she sabotaging Newman Enterprises? The thought was unthinkable, yet the evidence pointed in one direction. Phyllis was working behind his back. Nick's emotions swirled between anger, disappointment, and heartbreak. He had stood by Phyllis through countless scandals, defended her when no one else would, and even forgiven her betrayals in the past. But this felt different. It wasn't just about business, it was personal. She had looked him in the eye and lied. When he confronted her the next morning, she immediately went on the defensive. "You've been spying on me?" she snapped, her tone laced with indignation. Nick could hardly believe her reaction. "Don't turn this around on me, Phyllis," he said, his voice cold but controlled. "You've been making secret deals with Tucker McCall. You lied to my face." Phyllis tried to charm her way out of it at first, denying everything, but when Nick laid out the evidence, emails, bank transfers, even a recording of her conversation with Tucker, her facade cracked. Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment, she looked genuinely broken. "Nick, you don't understand," she pleaded. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. Tucker offered me something I couldn't refuse. A chance to fix everything I lost." Nick's jaw tightened. "Fix it? By stabbing me in the back?" He shot back. Phyllis's voice trembled as she explained that Tucker had promised to help her regain control of the Grand Phoenix completely, to cut ties with the investors who'd been pressuring her. "I just wanted my independence back," she whispered. "I didn't think it would hurt you." But to Nick, it wasn't just about business motives, it was about loyalty. "You always say you want to be trusted, Phyllis," he said quietly. "But how can I trust someone who keeps lying every time things get tough?" Phyllis reached for his hand, but he pulled away, the distance between them heavier than words. She tried to justify her actions, insisting that she was only protecting herself, that she never intended to drag him or Newman into it. But Nick saw through it. Deep down, he knew that Phyllis's instincts for self-preservation always overpowered her love for anyone else. As the confrontation unfolded, years of unresolved tension spilled out. Nick reminded her of the countless times she had sabotaged her own happiness, faking her death, manipulating allies, blackmailing enemies. "You always say you've changed," Nick said bitterly. "But every time I start to believe it, you prove me wrong." Phyllis's face crumpled as she tried to hold back tears. "You don't know what it's like, Nick," she said softly. "People like me, we don't get second chances. We have to fight for everything we have." Nick shook his head. "You had a second chance. You had me." After their explosive argument, Phyllis left the house, unable to face him or the mess she'd created. Nick, meanwhile, was left grappling with conflicting emotions. Part of him still loved her deeply, but another part couldn't forget the betrayal. He confided in Sharon later that week, seeking perspective. Sharon, surprisingly gentle in her response, reminded him that Phyllis had always been her own worst enemy. "You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved," Sharon said. "But maybe this time, she'll realize what she's lost." Nick nodded, but his heart was heavy. He didn't know if he could ever forgive Phyllis again. Meanwhile, Phyllis spiraled in private.